Stress is something that we all face to a greater or a lesser extent. We live in a culture that promotes if it's going to be, it's up to me. But
Mhm.
if we aren't careful to attend to appropriate stress management, prolonged stress can have a detrimental impact on our physical, emotional, and mental well being. If we go too long for too strong, ultimately our bodies will demand that we stop. So, how do we work towards a better work life balance? That's what we'll be discussing on today's episode. Welcome back to another episode of your Hope Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in your God given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and joining me for today's discussion about managing stress and working towards better work life balance is my co host, Pastor Jessica Van Roekel. Welcome back, Jessica.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm so glad to be back, and I'm excited to talk about this topic.
I think we can both use it, so hopefully our listeners can relate. Stress
Mm.
comes from a variety of places, but what I know personally, as well as a neuropsychologist, is that if we don't learn to manage stress, it will manage us.
Mm.
We as women struggle with the work-life balance in a unique way because culture tells us that success is gained or lost in the workplace. Yet, we are often the primary caregivers for our family, which includes everything from laundry to holiday costume sewing to permission slip signing and kissing boo-boos. In 1970, about 43% of women ages 16 and older were in the labor force. 43%. But by 2000, 61% of adult women were in the labor force, and that has continued through today. So, arguably, today women have more on their plates than a generation ago, with less time to rest and restore. Jessica, I'd be curious about your perspective, both as a faith leader and a working professional.
I do think that the work-life balance is tricky. And I've discovered that if I don't put some extra effort into seeking even scale type of a thing, that I get a little snappy with my family. My family gets the brunt of my stress, and God impressed upon me years ago that my family needs to get my first fruits. Does that make sense? That's an Old Testament word, and really our first fruits should belong to God. But then my next set of efforts really needs to go towards my family. My family deserves my best. They're my number one area of ministry, but so often stress can cause me to put them at the bottom of the barrel, and then they get the drudges. When you have an old coffee pot with a little bit of coffee in the bottom and it's that yucky, gross, bitter, that's me. And so I'm excited to share with you and to have this discussion and share with our listeners about this work-life balance, the myths, the ideas of how we can reach for that and strive for that.
That's why today we're going to be talking about managing stress and working towards better work-life balance. And in today's episode, we're going to be offering practical faith-based strategies to manage stress and to restore balance.
Michelle, as a neuropsychologist, how do you define stress?
Stress is both a physiological and a psychological response that occurs when we perceive a threat or a challenge that exceeds our coping resources. And that's the key. It's something that exceeds our coping resources. This perception triggers the body's central stress management system, particularly the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is that part of our body that regulates our heart
Mm.
rate, blood to our muscles, alertness so that you can focus on danger or run away. and it
Mm.
leads to the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. But once the stress passes, Jess, that HPA axis should return to normal.
Huh.
Unfortunately, in today's culture, it often doesn't because we live life at a heightened state of stress most of the time.
Okay.
And here's the interesting thing. Our brain does not know the difference between good stress or bad stress. So our brain doesn't know if we are going to a wedding, which is
Mm.
stressful. It's a good stress, but
Yeah.
it's stressful, or whether we're going to a funeral. And while
Mhm.
the natural stress response is useful for short-term danger,
Mhm.
like a robbery,
Mhm.
chronic stress keeps these hormones elevated for extended
Mhm.
periods, which can harm both our mental and physical health. And we're going to
Mhm.
talk about that after the break. Friends, we're going to take a real short break before we get into the real meat of today's episode. But don't go anywhere because when we return, we're going to talk about the challenges to work-life balance, the
Mhm.
effects of prolonged stress, and common factors impacting the rise of stress. We'll be
Mhm.
right back. Welcome back to your hope-filled perspective, where today Jessica and I are talking about managing stress and working towards work-life balance. So just before the break, we were talking about the definition of stress and the
Mhm.
fact that our brain doesn't know the difference between good stress or bad stress, which makes it all the more important that we learn to manage it.
Oh, that is so true. And I found that there's some cultural expectations around success, and it almost feels like you have to be perfect. If you're going to be successful, you have to be perfect, or you have to rise to the top of everything that you do. You know, you need to have the Midas touch, you know, that old fable where everything you touch turns to gold. But I find that impossible. I think perfection crushes me. So, this cultural expectation about having it all, like you can have it all, I don't really think exists because I don't think we can have it all at once. So, this idea of perfect balance doesn't exist. Michelle, why do you believe perfect balance is a myth?
It's a myth because balance is fluid and flexible. So think
Mm,
about getting on a scale to weigh yourself.
yeah.
The result that you see, the number that comes across on the scale is fluid based on the time of day, what you're wearing, what you ate or drank that day or the day or two before. Even stress impacts that number on the scale. And here's what's interesting, because I do routinely get on the scale in the morning. But if I were to get on the scale 2 hours later,
Hmm.
that number is often different. And I think that's a picture of this myth of perfect work-life balance. It's very fluid. It depends on what's going on at work, what's going on in our family, what's going on in our health, what's going on in our circumstances. So there is no perfect work-life balance, but we can work towards better work-life balance. Jess, I want you to talk for just a minute about a different way that we could look at this work-life balance.
Oh, I would love to share about adopting a seasonal perspective. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is a time for, a time for, a time for reaping, a time for sowing, a time for tearing up, building up, and a time for tearing down. Sometimes our career demands take precedence, while other times family needs need to take precedence. It's this extending grace to yourself and adjusting priorities based on the seasons of our life. This is what prevents guilt and burnout. It prevents shame of not being able to maintain this have it all the time. We can have it all, just not all at once. And one of the things that we have this idea about is that we can multitask. But Michelle, could you share our brain and multitasking? And is that even part of this perfect work-life balance that we all seem to strive for?
I'm real glad that you brought that up. So the first myth that we addressed is that of perfect work-life balance, which is impossible. The
Mhm.
second myth that we need to talk about is the myth of multitasking. It
Mm.
is physiologically impossible for your brain to multitask. And I know people feel so accomplished when they say, I'm great at multitasking. But in actuality, when you try to multitask, it's like when you're watching a TV show and a commercial comes on. That commercial distracts your attention from what you were previously taking in. The same thing
Mm.
happens when we try to multitask because it's like minute interruptions in your brain's ability to focus and attend. It's just not possible. Focus on one thing till you get to an appropriate stopping point. Then you can move on to something else.
Oh, that is so good. And I have found that I cannot take, I cannot work on a project, like study something while I'm trying to talk to a friend on the phone. It doesn't work. I don't even know what she's saying. I don't know what I'm writing. It doesn't work. It just doesn't. So let's talk about how chronic stress affects our bodies and minds over time. Michelle, could you dive into the effects of stress on our bodies?
This is so important because if you have no other motivation to try to manage your stress, I'm hoping this will provide you motivation because prolonged stress can significantly affect our well-being in the following ways. In the physical realm, with respect to our physical health, chronic stress can cause headaches, muscle tension, fatigue, and a weakened immune system. This is
Oh.
really important. There was a study done years ago, and it found that college students had a pretty good immune system during the semester, but when they would come home, they would
Mhm.
tend to get sick. Well, the reason
Mm.
is because they were pushing through the semester, and it weakened their immune system. And so when they got home and they could relax, it wreaked havoc on their bodies.
Wow.
But prolonged stress also raises the risk of heart disease, high blood
Mm.
pressure, digestive issues, and sleep disturbances, impacting overall physical wellness. But stress also has significant effects on the brain function and structure. So, acute stress, which is short term, comes on suddenly, doesn't last very long, that actually can sharpen our focus and
Mhm.
improve our short-term performance because it enhances activity in the brain regions like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. But chronic stress can have adverse effects and lead to devastating structural changes in the brain. So, chronic stress can lead to a reduction in the size of the hippocampus, which affects memory, the
Mm.
prefrontal cortex, which affects decision making and executive functioning, and it potentially increases the size and activity of the amygdala, which heightens our emotional responses. So our
Mm.
brain health is adversely impacted by chronic stress. Our mental health is also adversely impacted because chronic stress often leads to constant worry, difficulty concentrating, and memory issues. And the
Mm.
brain, under prolonged stress, struggles to function optimally. So it makes it
Mm.
harder to focus and to think clearly. And then lastly, prolonged stress affects our emotional health. Emotionally, prolonged stress can lead to feelings of irritability, anxiety, and even hopelessness and despair. And it
Mm.
can cause mood swings and may even contribute to depression because persistent stress wears down our emotional resilience.
All
So
right, so
let's,
that's amazing.
yeah, there, if that doesn't give you motivation to
Yeah.
try to manage your stress better, I'm not sure what will.
Oh, I do think just a couple things that really stood out to me is number one, our brain doesn't know the difference between good or bad stress. So we need to be the ones to care for our brain. Yes?
Yes.
And just these four reasons, I'm like, okay, right here. I don't need any more reasons. We got more.
Yeah.
But this is funny, but my scalp will hurt when I'm really stressed out. And I'm like, I asked my cosmetologist friend, I'm like, why does it feel like I can't even touch my hair. She goes, "Oh, for some people, stress once tries to leave their bodies through their hair roots." I'm like, "Oh,
Well,
that's
the other
interesting."
reason is because when you're in prolonged stress, you may not even realize it, but people tend to tighten their shoulders
Mm.
and hold their neck rigid. And
It does.
so it's
Yeah,
affecting those sensory
everything.
receptors that go up into your scalp.
Yes, yes. So we've got four excellent reasons of why we need to manage this work-life balance. But let's talk now about some contributing factors to the rise of stress in our life.
Oops.
And I think the biggest one, I can't rate them. They're all big. But
They
the
are.
first one that I want to talk about is this social media and digital connectivity. This constant connectivity has been shown to increase stress. As people may feel pressured, and I'll raise my hand and say, I have experienced this myself. I feel pressured by comparisons. I get to see people's highlight reels and it looks so great. And I'm looking at the messiest kitchen, home, you know, no
Yep.
work-life balance. And then there's this notifications or this need to find out what's happening in the world. FOMO, fear of missing out, right? It happens. And in fact, there's been a study that I read about kids these days bring their school problems home with them because they're in their back pocket through their phone. And I can remember being a kid, we left school at school because if you wanted to talk to your friend, you had to go to a landline, a phone connected to a wall, and call them. And at my house, you could only talk for like 15 minutes before you had to hang it up. So we have this social media and digital connectivity that influences the rise of stress. Another one is sociocultural changes. So we find that with increased academic and career pressures. If you can't be the best, why try it all, right? There's this societal instability. We have this ghosting and cancel culture. Are you going to, if you stand for something, are you going to lose a family member or a friend? And then, of course, we're facing economic uncertainty. And these three factors can contribute to heightened stress. Then, when we go into our environmental factors of stressful life events, traumatic experiences, and even lack of social support, which is interesting in the light of that we are so connected digitally, and
Right?
yet it has increased our lack of social support. These contribute to a rise in stress. And finally, the topic of why we're discussing work life balance is having a disordered work life balance. Having too much on our plate in one arena of our life, leading to insufficient time and energy to devote to other areas of our life, spurs stress. It spurs those feelings of overwhelm, which then impact our stress.
Mm. Those are four really big things that contribute to our stress. So it's going to be important for us and our listeners to even just focus on one, to try
Yeah.
to manage that one area better before moving on to another. But I'm really excited about the next segment of today's episode. But we're going to take a real quick commercial break before we dive into practical strategies for stress management. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your hope-filled perspective, where today we are talking about managing stress and working towards better work-life balance. We've talked about those areas that cause stress, contribute to heightened stress. We've talked about the impact on our physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So you might be thinking, okay, you've convinced me I need to at least take a survey of my stress levels and see where it's coming from. But now what do I do about it? I'm glad you asked because I want you to consider this. You may be able to do all things, but you cannot do all things well. So,
Mm.
one of the things that I think is so important is for you to consider adopting a weekly and daily planning ritual across both your work and personal life, whereby you establish, let's say, the top 10 priorities for the week. then the top three priorities for the day, and then circle any non-negotiable tasks.
Mm,
Let's say you have to go to a doctor's appointment. That might be your non-negotiable. So if nothing else happens, you at least manage that non-negotiable task. What this does is it narrows our focus and it
mm,
reduces the overwhelm of a long to-do list. This
mm.
is a particular challenge for me because I'm the kind who loves a long to-do list and I love checking things off. I've even been known to write things on the to-do list after I've done them, just for the dopamine hit of crossing it off. So consider a weekly and daily planning ritual. What would you
Oh,
suggest, Jessica?
I think that is fantastic. So we've got that practical outward expression. But I think we also need to look at ourselves when we consider that stress arises when situations exceed our coping resources,
Mhm.
and then anxiety results from a fear of losing control. If we can lower our expectations of others and ourselves, it
Yes.
leads to decreased stress and anxiety when things don't measure up.
We
I,
often
Mhm.
expect more out of ourselves
Yes.
than do others.
Yeah.
And so the way I've talked about it with patients before is I've sat them down and I said, if you were to list everything that you
Mm,
expect of yourself in a day or a week, I want you to tell me, would you reasonably expect
right.
the same thing from others? And most of the time,
No,
the answer is no, right? We have very high expectations of ourselves. And
we
yet we,
do.
just like you said, Jessica, we extend more grace to other people than we do ourselves.
We do. We do.
So the next practical strategy is to set boundaries. We
Hmm.
teach people how to treat us. And part of that is by setting and respecting boundaries.
Yep.
And this includes learning to say no or not now
Mhm.
gracefully, as well as asking for help without guilt. Furthermore, appropriate boundary setting includes prioritizing non-negotiable family time,
Mhm.
reserving specific hours for work, and protecting time for self-care.
Well, let's consider self-care as non-negotiable. We've all heard the example of putting on your own oxygen mask first.
Right.
If we can redefine self care as essential for your mental and physical health, including basics like adequate nutrition, exercise, scheduled rest breaks throughout the day, and consistent sleep hygiene, we are going to find that our stress levels reduce.
Yes. I would
Mm,
throw in there that self-care also includes self-compassion,
yeah.
especially on challenging days.
Yep.
Let's face it, Jessica, there are no perfect days.
No,
But
none.
how we talk to ourselves on
Yeah.
both good and challenging days matters. So
Yeah.
pay attention to your thoughts and think of it this way. Would you talk to a friend the same way you talk to yourself when you haven't checked everything off your list for the day?
No, I wouldn't. In fact, I would give grace. I'd say, it's okay. You're
Right?
exhausted. You didn't sleep well last night. Just call it a scratch day and let's start again tomorrow. Why can't I talk to myself that way?
Yeah. We're so busy
We
listening to the
are.
enemy
Yes.
who is the
Yes.
accuser of the brethren. He's accusing
Hmm.
us to ourselves. So if you can't do it for yourself, ask a
You,
friend to help. Jessica, you and I, that
absolutely.
is one of the things I appreciate about our friendship is that we're both really good at pointing the other one back to,
Yes.
hey, give yourself a little grace, would you? You just went through X, Y, and Z,
Yeah, exactly. That so we can do that to our for each other and for ourselves. But another thing that's really important is to prioritize rest. There's a passage in Isaiah where it says that through rest we find our strength.
Mhm.
And we cannot pour from an empty cup.
But we
There's
try.
But we try. We try. So our brain requires periods of rest in order to continue pouring out. And even just 5 minutes of prayer or meditation every hour holds positive benefits. It's not when we talk about self-care, we're not saying go have a retreat at a spa. We're not saying go pay $65 for a half hour massage. We're saying self care can look like taking a 5 minute break,
Yes.
taking a cat nap. In fact, mostly I think, though, it's coming to Jesus. Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30 says this: Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus encourages us to rest, and we can even find that rest in the midst of chaos. We can know the peace that passes all understanding, even when everything around us is falling to pieces.
Oh, that's so good. Because if Jesus could sleep in the middle of a storm
Yeah.
on a boat,
Yes.
what makes us think that we can't take time to rest in Him in
Right.
the middle of our chaotic schedule?
Yes. Oh, that's so good. Michelle, could you dive into what reframing success could look like in helping us manage this work-life balance?
I think it's really important for us to challenge the success myth. There's a
Mm,
tendency, especially among professional women, to equate success and self-worth with
mm,
productivity, accomplishments, and perfection. I did. I did. I thought the more I did, the more God would love me, and the
mm,
more colleagues would esteem me, and the more patients would believe me. My core value, though, needs to be that one of doing things with excellence as unto the Lord. But that does not equal perfection. So
mm,
let me encourage our listeners and viewers to adopt a growth mindset instead of a success mindset, because understanding that true success includes inner peace and joy,
mm,
not just career milestones.
right.
Never has anyone ever said at the end of their life that I've heard of that they wish they had worked more, Jessica.
No, I don't
So
think so either.
how about if we consider envisioning that a successful life, and I put that in air quotes, includes time for loved ones,
Mm.
mental wellness, personal fulfillment, and spiritual growth?
Oh, that is so good to consider success as the internal earmarks of success. Resilience, grit, faith, joy, peace in the midst, sleeping, resting in the midst of chaos. So, when we want to consider this managing work life balance, I think we need to bring it back to faith as our foundation.
Mhm.
If we can surrender control to God and stay anchored in faith, we're going to be able to ride the waves of stress, if that makes sense. We ride the waves of busy times and slow times and chaotic times and peaceful times. It's this surrendering of control and yet making God our anchor. And I think about a boat in a river or a lake or something with a current. The anchor goes down and the boat moves. It moves as far as the anchor, lets it, however long the anchor's let out. It bobs with the waters, but it doesn't drift into rocks. It doesn't drift into a shipwreck. It doesn't drift into another boat. It stays anchored. And I think that's a beautiful picture of this surrendering of control while still feeling the effects of life and yet still staying anchored. in God. And we know that biblical principles support rest and peace. Matthew 11:28 through 30. Take some time this week and go read that for yourself. Write it down on a card. And then Ecclesiastes 3 is another great reminder that our life is centered around seasons. We can't always be in a season of growth. We have to have seasons of rest as well.
I'm really glad that you wrapped up our practical tips and strategies, focusing on staying surrendered to God and
Mm,
staying anchored in faith, because scripture talks about only what is done for the Lord is going to count.
yes.
And the Lord models rest for us, going all the
Yeah.
way back to Genesis. And for a long time, I viewed rest as a dirty four-letter word. But
Oh,
in actuality, God
mm,
knows that we have to have natural rhythms and we have to have rest if we want to be able to continue effectively
mm,
in our call. Friends, we've given you a lot of practical tips and
mhm.
strategies. But Jessica, if a listener is resonating with today's episode, maybe they're really feeling stressed.
Yeah.
What hope-filled perspective would you want to leave them with today?
I would want to point you to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and by still waters. He restores your soul. When we rest in him, our cup overflows. And this Psalm 23 even talks about in the face of our enemies, he sets a table of abundance for us so that we can partake with him. So, my hope filled perspective would be to return to the shepherd, to return to the shepherd's fold, to allow him to guide you, to allow him to guide you to rest, to know that he watches over you while you rest. So, the Lord is your shepherd. You don't have to be in want.
Friends, I hope that something in today's episode has encouraged you. We all face stress, good and bad, but we're not all equally able to manage it.
Mm,
So I hope that you'll even go back and re-listen to portions of today's episode. And I want to encourage you to adopt just one new strategy this week. You don't have to do them all, because the goal of this is not to add stress to your plate, but to help you be able to manage it better, to
mhm,
have more margin for family and other commitments. Just choose one and then let
mhm.
us know how it goes. We would love to hear in the comments or in our follow-up blog post that you'll find at drmichelleb.com on Monday. It has been a joy to be with you, Jessica, and to talk about this very common problem.
Yep.
I'm so grateful that God has given us suggestions in His very word
Oh,
of things
yes.
that we should be doing. And
Oh,
those need to be at the top of our to-do list.
yes.
Friends, it's been a delight to be with you. I hope that you found today's episode encouraging. Would you consider sharing it with a friend who needs encouragement in a really stressful time? We plan to be back with you again next week. But until then, it's my prayer for you that you have a hope-filled week.